first set of footprints could have been a coincidence. The second set made me uneasy. But when I found the third set of fresh boot prints behind me on a trail where I hadn't seen another soul all day, I knew something was very wrong. I'd picked Thursday for my hike, specifically to avoid other people. The Continental Divide Trail offers some of Colorado's best autumn hiking, but the weekends bring crowds. The empty parking lot at Pine Ridge Trailhead had been a welcome sight when I pulled in that morning. Just my dusty Subaru and the endless stretch of pines ahead. The morning started perfectly. Frost glittered on fallen leaves, and my breath came out in clouds that disappeared in the crisp mountain air. My boots crunched rhythmically against the trail as I made steady progress toward Baker Lake, 12 miles ahead. I'd done this route before, but never this late in the season. The solitude felt like a gift. Until my first water break, I was kneeling by a stream, filtering water into my bottle, when I noticed them. Boot prints in the mud beside the creek. Sharp-edged and fresh, with a distinctive vibram sole pattern. I frowned, thinking back to the empty parking lot. The prints didn't make sense. If someone had started earlier, these tracks should have been weathered by the morning frost. I tried to shake off my unease as I continued climbing, but now I found myself studying the trail more carefully. The path alternated between rocky sections and patches of soft dirt. In each dirt section, those same boot prints appeared behind me. The pattern was unmistakable, size 11 or 12, with a small chip missing from the right heel. My pace quickened unconsciously. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. A ranger doing trail maintenance, another hiker who'd parked elsewhere, a hunter scouting the area. But if it was someone innocent, why hadn't they caught up during my breaks? Why hadn't I seen or heard them? The trail wound through a section of massive granite boulders, each one a potential hiding spot. That's when I noticed something that turned my unease into real fear. The boot prints occasionally veered off the trail into the brush, then reappeared further along. Someone wasn't just following my path. They were moving parallel through the trees, deliberately staying out of sight. I stopped checking my map. Each pause felt dangerous now, an opportunity for whoever was behind me to close the distance. The only sounds were my own increasingly rapid breathing, the tap of my trekking poles, and the wind sighing through the pines. No footsteps, no breaking branches. Just those prints appearing as if by magic behind me. My phone showed no signal, expected at this elevation, but unsettling nonetheless. I still had 4 miles to Baker Lake, but the thought of setting up camp with my shadow lurking in the darkness made my skin crawl. The sun was sliding toward the ridgeline when the footprints changed. They were getting closer to my own tracks, sometimes overlapping them completely. The message couldn't have been clearer. They were gaining on me. A branch snapped in the woods to my left. I spun around, wielding my trekking poles like spears, but saw only shadows between the trees. My heart slammed against my ribs. Standing still felt like painting a target on my back, but each step forward took me further from safety. That's when I saw movement ahead, a dark shape ducking behind a boulder. My stalker had somehow gotten in front of me. The trail ahead narrowed between 2 rock faces, creating a perfect ambush point. I froze, options spinning through my mind. I could push forward and face whatever waited in that gap. I could turn around and try to outrun my pursuer in the gathering darkness. Or I could leave the trail entirely, betting my navigation skills against theirs. My hands trembled as I pulled out my satellite messenger, an expensive piece of gear I'd never thought I'd need. I pressed the SOS button and watched the red light start blinking. Help would come, but not for hours. Another shadow moved ahead, closer now. They were getting impatient. I made my choice. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped off the trail to the right, toward a ridge that would eventually connect with a different trail back to the parking lot. The detour would add hours to my journey, but it beat walking into a trap. Pine needles muffled my footsteps as I moved through the deepening twilight. I kept my headlamp off, using the last gray light to navigate by the ridgeline above. 10 minutes passed, and I heard what I'd been dreading. Fast footsteps on the main trail, slowing near where I'd left it. A beam of light cut through the trees. I crouched behind a fallen log as heavy boots crunched through the underbrush. I know you left the trail." The voice was male, calm, almost friendly. "You're only making this harder." I stayed frozen, gripping my trekking poles and barely breathing. The light beam moved methodically through the trees as my pursuers searched in a grid pattern. The footsteps would fade, then grow louder again. Just when I thought they'd moved far enough away, pine needles crunched directly behind me. Before I could turn, something hard struck the back of my head. As darkness crowded in, I caught one final glimpse of those boots stepping into view. Vibram soles, size 12, with a chip missing from the right heel. 3 days later, search and rescue found my backpack 5 miles from the trail. They never found my body, but hikers still report fresh boot prints appearing behind them on that section of trail, size 12, Vibram soles, with a chip missing from the right heel. The fourth click was different from the others. Metallic, deliberate, and far too precise to be an animal. That's when I realized whatever was testing my bear canister in the darkness wasn't a bear at all. I'd chosen this remote spot in the Bridger Teton Wilderness specifically for its wildlife photography opportunities. 3 days of solitude to capture the changing autumn colors and, if I was lucky, some of the elk moving down from the high country. The first 2 nights had been peaceful. Just me, my camera gear, and the endless Wyoming stars. The clicking started on the 3rd night. At first, I dismissed it as normal camp sounds. The cooling metal of my cook set, branches settling in the wind, maybe a curious marmot investigating my camp. But there was a pattern to it, a methodical quality that wormed its way into my consciousness as I lay in my tent. Click, pause, click, pause, like someone slowly turning a combination lock. My bear canister sat 30 feet from my tent, properly stored according to backcountry regulations. I'd been fastidious about food storage. 9 years of wilderness photography had taught me the importance of keeping everything scented, from toothpaste to lip balm, secured overnight. Bears were common here, but they usually made more noise. They'd knock the canister around, roll it down hills, sometimes even carry it off into the woods in frustration. This was different. Each click was followed by silence, as if whatever was out there was thinking, analyzing, trying to understand the mechanism. I lay still in my sleeping bag, straining to hear more details. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light that I could see shadows moving across my tent walls. Something large was definitely out there. Click! My headlamp sat within easy reach, but I hesitated to turn it on. Light would reveal my watcher, but it would also destroy my night vision and expose my location in the darkness. The logical part of my brain still tried to catalog this as normal wildlife behavior, but my instincts screamed otherwise. The sound stopped abruptly. Seconds stretched into minutes of tense silence. Just when I started to relax, thinking whatever it was had given up, I heard soft footsteps in the pine needles. Not the heavy thumping of bare paws or the clatter of hooves. These were careful, deliberate steps moving closer to my tent. My hand closed around my bear spray. I'd never had to use it on anything other than a curious black bear, but its familiar shape was reassuring. The footsteps circled my tent once, slowly, stopping at each corner as if taking measurements. Then came a whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. "This isn't the right size either." My blood turned to ice. Human words spoken with clear purpose, here in the absolute middle of nowhere. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the trailhead 3 days ago, and I was at least 15 miles from the nearest road. The footsteps retreated, and the clicking resumed, but now I could picture human hands manipulating my bear canister, methodically testing its locking mechanism. My mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. I was alone, 3 days from my pickup date, with no cell service and a stranger who was far too interested in my food storage. Morning seemed years away, but eventually the sky began to lighten. The clicking had stopped sometime before dawn, but I waited until full light before slowly unzipping my tent. The scene outside appeared normal at first. My bear canister stood upright, exactly 30 feet from camp where I'd left it. But as I approached, I noticed marks around the locking mechanism, small scratches in precise patterns, like someone had been mapping out its workings. I packed up quickly, hands shaking as I collapsed my tent. The morning felt too quiet, empty of the usual bird sounds. As I shouldered my pack, movement caught my eye at the forest's edge, a figure in full wilderness gear, standing motionless between two pines. Not the typical bright colors of hiking gear, but muted grays and greens that blended with the forest. They wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed their face, but I could feel them watching me. In their hands was another bear canister, identical to mine. I didn't wait to see more. I abandoned my carefully planned photo route and headed straight for the nearest trail junction, moving as fast as I safely could with a full pack. The sound of clicking followed me through the trees, growing fainter with distance. That evening, at a different campsite many miles away, I studied my bear canister in the fading light. The scratches formed a definite pattern, numbers and arrows precisely carved into the plastic. A combination someone had worked out, testing systematically through the night. I used a different lock pattern that night. In the morning, I found my canister had been moved again, fresh scratches marking its surface. But this time, something had been left beside it. Another bear canister, cracked open like an egg, its contents missing. The message was clear. They were learning, testing, improving their technique with each container they found. My carefully secured food wasn't the target. They wanted the knowledge, the understanding of how to defeat these supposedly bear-proof devices. I abandoned my trip that day, hiking out 12 miles to the nearest ranger station. They found 5 more damaged bear canisters scattered through that section of wilderness, each one showing signs of increasingly sophisticated tampering. They never found who was responsible, but backcountry hikers still report hearing clicking sounds at night. Some say they've glimpsed a figure in muted grays and greens, moving silently through the trees, always carrying a bear canister, always learning. I still go wilderness photographing, but now I hang my food in bear bags, the old-fashioned way. Better to risk actual bears than whatever was studying my canister that night. Click by patient click in the darkness. When my compass disappeared, I figured I'd misplaced it. When my spare socks vanished, I blamed my scattered packing. But when I found my missing items arranged in a perfect spiral 300 yards from my campsite, I knew someone was playing a game I didn't want to be part of. It started on my second night of a week-long trek through the Adirondacks. I'd been planning this solo hike for months, carefully mapping a route that would take me through some of the most remote sections of the High Peaks wilderness. September meant fewer bugs, fewer hikers, and fall colors just starting to paint the mountains. The first day went exactly as planned. 15 miles of steady hiking put me deep into the backcountry, where I made camp in a small clearing beside a stream. I was meticulous about my gear. Years of backpacking had taught me to keep everything organized. My tent, my cook set, my food bag, properly hung from a branch, and my pack all had their precise places. I woke that first morning to find a single protein bar missing from my food bag. The rope hadn't been touched, and nothing else was disturbed. I wrote it off as a particularly clever raccoon and made a mental note to be more careful with my food storage. The second night, my emergency compass disappeared from the outer pocket of my pack. I spent an hour searching the area around my camp, convincing myself I must have dropped it on the trail. But something felt wrong. The pocket zipper had been carefully closed after the compass was removed. By the third night, I was double-checking every item before I went to bed. I counted my remaining protein bars, secured every zipper, and even took photos of how I arranged my gear. I woke to find my spare pair of hiking socks gone, the thick wool ones I'd packed for emergencies. The rest of my gear was untouched. That's when I started noticing the arrangements. About 300 yards from my campsite, in a small clearing I'd passed gathering firewood, my missing items had been carefully placed on the ground. The protein bar wrapper, unfolded and flattened, formed the center. My compass had been positioned precisely north of it. The socks had been unrolled and curved to form the beginning of a spiral. I stood staring at the pattern, my skin crawling. This wasn't random animal behavior or typical vandalism. Someone was taking my things with purpose, arranging them with deliberate care, creating something that felt like a message or a trap. I gathered my items and hurried back to camp, shoving them deep into my pack. My hand brushed my map as I did so, and my stomach dropped. If they took my map next, I spent that day hiking faster than planned, pushing to cover extra miles. Every time I stopped to check my location or filter water, I felt watched. The forest seemed too quiet, missing the usual squirrel chatter and bird calls. Twice I spun around, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me, but saw only empty trail. That night, I chose a campsite on high ground with clear sight lines in all directions. I stayed awake as long as I could, watching the darkness beyond my small fire. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to create shifting shadows that played tricks with my eyes. Every rustle in the underbrush sounded like footsteps. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke to gray dawn light and another missing item, my trail map. My heart pounded as I searched my pack, but I already knew where I'd find it. Sure enough, 300 yards from camp. They were consistent. I had to give them that. I found another arrangement. The protein bar wrapper still formed the center point. My compass pointed north. The socks curved around them, and my map had been carefully torn into triangular pieces that radiated outward, forming a perfect geometric pattern that reminded me of a spiderweb or a sundial. My hands shook as I gathered the pieces of my map. I had a backup on my phone, but out here, with no signal and limited battery, that was a last resort. As I picked up the last fragment, I noticed something else. Small marks drawn on each piece in what looked like charcoal from my fire. When I arranged the pieces correctly, they formed numbers, coordinates. I didn't know whether they were pointing me towards something or warning me away, but I didn't intend to find out. I had enough food for 4 more days, but decided to cut my trip short. I turned west, following the most direct route back to the trailhead, about 2 days hard hiking away. That night, despite my exhaustion, I didn't make camp. I hiked through dusk and into darkness, using my headlamp and pushing myself to cover as much ground as possible. Every time I considered stopping, I imagined finding another careful arrangement of my possessions, another message I didn't want to receive. Around midnight, I had to rest. I found a small grove of pines and sat with my back against a trunk, planning to close my eyes for just a few minutes. When I opened them, sunlight was streaming through the branches, and my headlamp was gone. I didn't have to walk 300 yards to find it. The arrangement was closer this time, close enough that I must have walked right past it in the darkness. My protein bar wrapper, compass, socks, and torn map pieces formed an intricate pattern on the ground. My headlamp sat in the center, its beam pointing directly at my resting spot. They had watched me sleep. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, stopping only when I physically couldn't continue. When I finally slowed to a walk, I realized I hadn't grabbed my items from their latest arrangement. For the first time in 3 days, I smiled. Let them keep their trophies. I made it back to my car just before sunset. The parking lot was empty except for a single park ranger truck. The ranger was genuinely concerned when I reported what had happened, but his next words chilled me more than anything else on the trail had. "You're the 3rd one this month," he said, checking his notes. "All solo hikers. All missing small items that turned up in geometric patterns. Always exactly 300 yards from camp." He paused, flipping through his notebook. "Did they leave you coordinates too?" I nodded. "Don't worry about those," he said. "We checked them all." They each point to the next victim's campsite, but only after the fact. Like they're mapping something, recording their work. I drove home that night, watching my rearview mirror more than the road. When I unpacked my gear, I found one last surprise tucked into my pack's brain pocket. A small piece of paper with a single line of text. "Thank you for your contributions to the collection." 3 weeks later, I received a package. Inside was everything that had been taken. The protein bar wrapper, the compass, the socks, the map pieces, the headlamp. All cleaned, carefully preserved, and mounted on black backing paper like museum pieces. Each item was labeled with precise coordinates, dates, and times. I still backpack, but never alone. And every time I pass a geometric arrangement of lost items on the trail, I walk a little faster, count my gear a little more carefully, and wonder about the collection that's still growing out there in the wilderness, piece by patient piece. Steam still rose from the coffee cup beside the tent when we found it. The sleeping bag was warm, as if its occupant had just stepped away. But something about the half-eaten energy bar, and the expensive camera, lying untouched, told us this wasn't a normal morning in the backcountry. My hiking partner Sarah and I had started our weekend trek at dawn, hoping to reach Alpine Lake before the afternoon storms rolled in. October in the Cascades meant unpredictable weather, but the morning had dawned clear and cold, with frost crunching under our boots as we made our way up the switchbacks. We'd been hiking together for years, comfortable enough with each other to maintain an easy silence as we climbed. The trail was empty, not unusual for a Thursday morning this late in the season. Most hikers had already switched to lower elevation routes, leaving the alpine zones to those of us who didn't mind the cold. The abandoned campsite appeared around a bend, about 4 miles into our hike. At first glance, it looked occupied. A green 2-person tent properly set up on a flat spot, a camp stove with a coffee cup beside it, hiking boots neatly placed outside the tent entrance. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the small clearing. No response. We waited a moment, exchanging glances. Usually, we'd hike past an occupied site with just a wave. But something felt wrong. The camp stove was still warm to the touch, coffee half finished beside it. An expensive Canon camera sat unprotected on a log, morning dew beating on its lens. "Maybe they're answering nature's call?" I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew that didn't make sense. No one would leave a $1,000 camera out in the open or abandon a hot cup of coffee. Sarah approached the tent carefully. "Hello? Anyone here?" She unzipped the entrance slowly, calling out again before looking inside. The sleeping bag was still warm when she touched it. A novel lay open, face down as if someone had just set it aside. A headlamp cast a dim circle on the tent ceiling. Batteries nearly dead, as if it had been left on all night. "James," Sarah called me over, her voice tight. "Look at this." The ground around the tent's other entrance, the one facing away from the trail, showed signs of a struggle. Pine needles were scraped away, exposing bare earth with deep scuff marks. A single trekking pole lay bent at an odd angle, its handle cracked. We found a wallet in the tent, along with a trail permit. Michael Chun, from Seattle. The permit was for 3 days, starting yesterday. His phone lay on top of his sleeping bag, showing no signal. The last text message was unfinished. "Something weird out here. Keep hearing what sounds like dash. We need to get help," Sarah said, already pulling out her own phone. No signal, as expected at this elevation. "The ranger station's only 2 miles back," I said. We could dash. A branch snapped in the forest behind the tent. We both spun toward the sound. The morning had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, no wind in the pines. Just that empty silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Another snap, closer this time. Then the distinct sound of footsteps moving through the underbrush, circling toward the trail. We didn't discuss it. We just moved quickly but quietly, back the way we'd come. Sarah led while I followed, both of us fighting the urge to run. The footsteps continued parallel to our path, always just out of sight in the dense forest. A voice called out behind us. Not quite words, but a sound that tried to be words. Like someone who had forgotten how to speak. We ran then, no longer caring about stealth. The footsteps behind us broke into a run as well, but they stayed in the woods, never emerging onto the trail. Whatever was following us seemed to know exactly where the trail curved and switched back, cutting straight down the slope to keep pace. The ranger station appeared after what felt like hours, but was probably 15 minutes. We burst through the door, gasping for breath, startling the ranger at her desk. The search began within the hour. They found the campsite exactly as we'd left it, but Michael Chin's sleeping bag was cold by then. His coffee cup had been emptied, the camera was gone, and new scuff marks scored the ground around the tent. They found Michael 3 days later, confused but alive, 5 miles off any trail. He couldn't explain what had happened or how he got there. The only thing he remembered was waking up to strange sounds outside his tent, then footsteps circling closer and closer. His camera was never recovered, but 6 months later, developed photos from his memory card started appearing on random hiking forums. All-night shots, all slightly blurred, showing the same thing. A tent in the darkness, someone's shadow moving inside, unaware they were being watched. Sarah and I still hike together, but never in that part of the Cascades. Sometimes, on cold mornings when the trail is empty, we'll catch the scent of coffee on the wind, or hear footsteps moving through the trees beside us. When that happens, we turn around. Some mysteries in the wilderness are better left unsolved. Last week, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph printed on glossy paper. It showed Sarah and me standing at that abandoned campsite, looking down at the warm sleeping bag. The photo was taken from the trees behind the tent, exactly where we'd heard those footsteps. On the back, someone had written in precise letters, "Thank you for not staying longer." Some audiences prefer to remain unseen. The rangers now keep a file of similar incidents. Abandoned camps found intact, warm sleeping bags with no occupants, expensive gear left behind. Always in the early morning, always with signs of fresh coffee or breakfast preparation. Always with footprints leading nowhere. They've started calling them photographers' camps, though no one's sure why. Maybe because cameras are often left behind, or because of those mysterious photos that keep appearing. Or maybe because something out there is still watching, still documenting, still waiting for the perfect shot. I sold my tent after that day. Sarah kept hers, but she never camps alone anymore. We stick to populated trails now, preferably ones with clear sight lines and few trees. And if we ever smell coffee on the morning wind, or hear footsteps moving through the forest beside us, we turn around immediately. Because somewhere in the Cascades, someone or something is still creating their own special collection of wilderness photography. And they're very particular about their subjects. The fourth blue blaze on the tree wasn't supposed to be there. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that this section only had 3 markers. Someone had painted a new one, leading deeper into the forest away from the main trail. And somehow, all the old blazes had vanished behind me. I'd started my day hike early, hitting the trailhead at Ravens Point just as the sun was rising. October in Vermont meant perfect hiking weather, crisp air, empty trails, and maple trees blazing red and gold against a clear sky. As one of the local search and rescue volunteers, I knew these paths better than my own neighborhood streets. The first few miles went exactly as expected. The blue blazes marking the main trail were right where they should be, every 100 yards or so, painted at eye level on the trees. I'd been part of the maintenance crew that refreshed these markers last spring. We followed strict guidelines about spacing and placement, making sure hikers could always see the next blaze from the current one. The first sign something was wrong came about 4 miles in. The blaze I expected to see on the old oak tree wasn't there. Instead, a fresh blue mark, the paint still looking wet, directed me slightly left of where the trail should go. I paused, checking my map. The new mark seemed to lead toward the same destination, just on a slightly different path. I took a photo of the marker with my phone, making a mental note to report it to the trail maintenance crew. Unauthorized blazes were a serious issue. They could confuse hikers and lead to dangerous situations. But the paint looked official, the same shade of blue we used. The next marker appeared exactly where I expected, so I kept hiking. But the third blaze was again slightly off course, leading me further left of the main trail. I stopped and looked back, intending to verify my position against the previous markers. They were gone, not weathered, not faded, completely gone. The trees where the blazes should have been stood bare, no sign they'd ever been painted. Even the unauthorized mark I just photographed had vanished. I pulled out my phone to check the photo, but the screen showed no image found. My heart rate picked up. I've been hiking these mountains for 20 years, taught navigation courses, helped with countless rescues. I don't get lost, but as I stood there, watching the shadows shift through the trees, I realized I wasn't entirely sure which direction I'd come from. A flash of blue caught my eye, another blaze, freshly painted, leading deeper into the forest. The paint glistened in the morning light, a droplet running down the tree trunk like a tear. As I watched, another marker appeared on a distant tree, the blue spreading across the bark as if painted by invisible hands. I pulled out my compass, an old reliable tool that had guided me through countless backcountry trips. The needle spun lazily, unable to find north. I checked my phone's GPS, but the screen showed me in a dozen different locations, the blue dot jumping erratically across the map. Another blaze appeared, then another, creating a new trail through the increasingly dense forest. The markers seemed to be leading somewhere specific, each one perfectly visible from the last, drawing me deeper into the woods like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. I'm not proud to admit it, but I followed them. 20 years of following blazes had trained me to trust trail markers. Each step took me further from where I thought the main trail should be, but the perfectly spaced blue marks promised a way forward. The forest grew darker as the trees closed in. The usual mountain sounds, birds, squirrels, wind in the leaves, faded to silence. Just my boots crunching on leaves and the soft tapping sound that seemed to precede each new blaze appearing. Tap! A fresh mark on a birch. Tap! Another on an old maple. Tap! Blue paint spreading across a boulder. I stopped walking. The tapping continued, moving ahead of me through the trees. In the distance, blazes were appearing and disappearing like some twisted light show, creating and erasing paths in every direction. That's when I noticed the boot prints in the mud beside the last marker. They looked fresh, but something about them was wrong. They started and stopped at random, as if their owner had appeared and disappeared between steps. Some pointed forward, others back, creating impossible patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. A blaze appeared on a tree directly in front of me, the blue paint forming itself into arrows pointing in multiple directions simultaneously. As I watched, the arrows began to move, spinning around the trunk like the hands of a broken clock. I'd like to say I made a rational decision at that point, that I used my training and experience to navigate myself out. But the truth is I ran. I turned around and sprinted back the way I thought I'd come, ignoring the blazes that flickered and shifted in my peripheral vision. I ran until my lungs burned, until the rational part of my brain finally took over and forced me to stop. Standard rescue protocol. If lost, stay put. I pulled out my emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal distress signal. The forest answered with 3 whistles of its own, coming from different directions. Then 3 more. Then 3 more, overlapping and echoing until the sound became a constant, mocking tone. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the spinning blazes and echoing whistles. When I opened them, I was standing on the main trail. The correct trail, with proper blue blazes spaced exactly where they should be. My GPS showed a clear location, and my compass pointed reliably north. I hiked out quickly, not stopping until I reached my car. The incident report I filed was vague, unauthorized trail markers, possible vandalism. I couldn't bring myself to describe what I'd really seen. But over the next few months, similar reports started coming in. Hikers following shifting blazes into the forest. Trail markers that appeared and disappeared. Impossible boot prints and echoing whistles. Always in different locations, always on solo hikes. The trail maintenance crews have started working in pairs. We carry GPS backups and redundant compasses. We document every blaze we paint with photographs and coordinates. But sometimes, working late in the day, we'll hear that soft tapping sound moving through the trees ahead of us. And every so often, hiking familiar trails, I'll spot a fresh blue blaze leading off into the forest. The paint always looks wet, a droplet running down the bark like a tear. I don't follow them anymore. Some paths aren't meant to be taken, some destinations better left unreached. But somewhere in these mountains, phantom trail markers are still appearing and disappearing, creating paths that lead everywhere and nowhere. And if you listen carefully on quiet autumn mornings, you might hear the soft tapping sound that comes just before a new blaze appears, marking another trail to somewhere no hiker is meant to go. The backpack floated by first, torn and empty, then a single hiking boot, followed by a shattered compass that caught the morning light as it spun in the current. When I spotted the trail map, edges bloodied and torn, I knew this wasn't just lost gear washing downstream. This was something worse. I'd chosen this spot carefully for my morning water break, a calm section of Crystal Creek where the stream widened and slowed. 6 miles into my 3-day solo trek in the Olympic National Forest, I was making good time despite the unseasonably cold September weather. The water filter hummed steadily as I filled my bottles, my mind wandering until that first piece of gear drifted past. The backpack was a high-end model, the kind serious hikers invest in. Its shoulder straps were shredded, not worn through but violently torn. As I fished it out with a stick, more items appeared in the current. An emergency blanket still folded in its packet, a titanium spork bent at an impossible angle, a phone in a waterproof case, its screen dark but unbroken. My hands shook as I checked the phone. Dead but warm, as if it had been used recently. The screen protector showed scratch marks that looked disturbingly like claw marks, but too precise, too deliberate for any animal I knew. Logic said to call for help, but my own phone showed no signal. The ranger station was 8 miles back, and the next one was 12 miles ahead. The scattered gear suggested someone was in trouble upstream, possibly right now. I made my decision quickly, securing the found gear to my pack and following the creek uphill. The trail paralleled the water for a while before veering away, but I stayed close to the stream. More items appeared as I climbed. A scattered trail of granola bar wrappers, a broken headlamp, pages torn from a trail guide. About half a mile up, the creek narrowed and the forest pressed closer. The usual sounds of birds and small animals had faded, leaving only the sound of rushing water and my own careful footsteps. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, despite the late morning sun. That's when I found the campsite. It was set back from the creek about 30 yards, partially hidden behind a stand of pines. A 2-person tent still stood, its door flapping open. A camp stove sat on a flat rock, a pot of water still warm to the touch. Someone's breakfast sat half-prepared, oatmeal mixed but uneaten, a coffee mug tipped on its side, contents soaking into the dirt. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the cold air. "Search and rescue. Anyone here?" The silence that answered felt wrong. No wind in the trees, no creek sounds despite its proximity, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just that deep, waiting silence that makes your skin crawl. The tent contained more evidence of a hasty departure. A sleeping bag still warm in spots, a journal open to a half-written entry, hiking boots neatly placed but missing their laces. The journal's last entry caught my eye. Day 2, something keeps moving gear while I sleep. Found my compass 50 yards upstream this morning. Water filter relocated to a rock in the creek. Thought bears at first, but the arrangements seemed deliberate. Items always placed in running water, always pointing upstream. Going to set up camera tonight, to the entry ended mid-sentence. The pen lay nearby, its cap still off. Between the tent and the creek, the ground told a story. Multiple sets of footprints, some running, others walking with unnatural precision. Deep gouges in the earth that no hiking boot could make. And drag marks, leading to the water's edge but not emerging. My training said to document everything, to take photos and notes for the search teams. But as I raised my phone to photograph the scene, I heard it, a soft splashing upstream, like something methodically moving through water. Then another splash, closer, and another. I backed away from the creek, eyes scanning the water. Something broke the surface about 50 yards upstream, an arm reaching up but wrong somehow. Too long, too fluid in its movement. It held what looked like the missing boot laces, weaving them into complex patterns before letting them sink. The splashing sounds multiplied, moving downstream toward me. The water surface began to ripple in geometric patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. Something was emerging from the creek, multiple somethings, bringing with them fragments of gear they'd collected. I ran. The trail was somewhere to my right, and I crashed through the underbrush toward it, not daring to look back. The splashing sounds followed, no longer confined to the creek. Wet footsteps slapped against rocks and leaves, cutting through the forest to parallel my route. I don't remember most of that run. I know I lost my water filter somewhere and one of my trekking poles. My pack caught on branches as I ran, but I didn't slow to adjust it. The sounds behind me grew fainter only when I finally broke onto the main trail, my legs shaking from effort and fear. The ranger station was a blur of activity after I stumbled in. Search teams deployed immediately, but they found only an empty campsite. The tent remained, along with the half-prepared breakfast, but all other gear had vanished. Even the items I'd gathered were gone from my pack, somehow taken during my panicked run. The missing hiker was Kevin Martinez, an experienced backpacker from Portland. They found his car at the trailhead, but no other trace. He was the third disappearance that season where gear had been found floating downstream. I filed my report, trying to stick to the facts without mentioning impossible arm shapes or geometric water patterns. But the ranger who took my statement seemed unsurprised by the details I left out. "We've been finding weird arrangements of gear in the creeks all summer," she said quietly. "Always pointing upstream. Always items that should sink but somehow float. Always warm to the touch, like they've just been handled." They closed that section of trail after 2 more hikers went missing. The official explanation cited unstable ground near the creek. But sometimes, on quiet mornings, hikers on nearby trails report hearing splashing sounds moving through the forest, accompanied by the metallic click of gear being arranged and rearranged. I still backpack, but never alone and never near Crystal Creek. And when I filter water now, I work quickly, try not to look too closely at what might be floating downstream. Because somewhere in those cold mountain waters, something is still collecting, still arranging, still waiting for more gear to add to its impossible underwater display.